Hello everyone, Sam Butchart here. In this lecture we're going to be talking about some basic concepts in argument evaluation. So ideas about what makes an argument a good or successful argument. And we'll be looking at two basic criteria for evaluating argument: truth of the premises and support. So if, as we've said, the purpose of an argument is to justify a claim by giving reasons, then a successful argument is one that succeeds in achieving that purpose. An argument that really does give you a good reason for thinking the conclusion is true. Different terms for that are successful, sound, cogent. There's nothing wrong with just talking about a good argument. These all mean the same thing. They mean an argument which succeeds in establishing its conclusion. So given any argument, there are always two different questions you can ask about it that are relevant to whether it's a successful argument or not. One question you can always ask is about the premises. Are the premises true? Should I accept those premises? That's a question you can always ask. A different question, which is to do with the connection between the premises and the conclusion, is this: do the premises support the conclusion? So what I mean by support is this: to say that the premises of an argument support a conclusion is to make a conditional claim. It's to say, if the premises were all true, they'd give you a sufficient reason for thinking that the conclusion was also true. They'd be sufficient to establish the conclusion if they were all true. That doesn't mean the premises are true. It certainly doesn't mean the conclusion is true. It's just a conditional claim. If you were to accept the premises as true, then you'd have a good reason to accept the conclusion as true. Different terms for that are used are valid. A valid argument is one that supports its conclusion in this conditional sense. Again, just means if the premises were true, the conclusion would be established. In that case, you can also say that the conclusion follows from the premises. I do want to emphasize this point, that for premises to support a conclusion in this conditional sense, they have to be sufficient to establish the conclusion. So it's not enough just that they provide a little bit of relevant evidence for the conclusion. They have to be sufficient. If you accepted the premises, that would give you a sufficiently good reason to accept the conclusion. So an argument that satisfies both of the two criteria that I've mentioned would be a successful, a cogent or a sound argument, all different terms for the same thing. Why? Well, look, if the premises support the conclusion, that means that if we accepted all the premises as true, we'd have a sufficiently good reason to believe the conclusion was true. And if the premises are in fact all true, then we do have a good reason for accepting the conclusion. So an argument satisfying both of those conditions succeeds in establishing its conclusion, and we'll call arguments that do that cogent or sound or successful. A very important point, which I will illustrate with some examples next, is this: these are independent conditions. And that means whether or not an argument satisfies one of them doesn't depend on whether it satisfies the other. An argument can support its conclusion without having true premises. The premises might be true but not support the conclusion. Let's look at some examples. So consider this argument. Imagine you're a detective investigating a murder and you've got evidence that the murderer, whoever they are, must be a left-handed person. Now suppose one of your suspects is Miss Green and you know that she's not left-handed. Conclusion you can draw is that she's not the murderer. Now in that argument the premises do support the conclusion, because if the premises were true, that would be a sufficient reason for excluding Green as the murderer. She can't be the murderer if she's not left-handed and you know that the murderer is left-handed. So if those two premises were true, then you'd have a sufficient reason to accept the conclusion. But notice the premises might not be true. That's a different question. Maybe you're mistaken and green is left-handed. But whether or not the premises are true doesn't make any difference to whether or not they support the conclusion. They do support the conclusion just because if they were true, that would give you a good enough reason to accept the conclusion as true. The conclusion would in fact have to be true if the premises were. If that's not clear, then have a look at this little diagram which represents the information in the premises. The first premise tells us that the murderer is one of the left-handed people. Here are all the left-handed people inside this circle, and we know the murderer is one of them. The second premise tells us that green is one of these people outside this circle. She's not one of the left-handed people, so she can't be the murderer. That just illustrates the fact that the premises in this argument support the conclusion. If they were true, the conclusion would be established. But of course they might not be true. That's a different question. You'd need evidence for the claims that green's not left-handed and the claim that the murderer must be left-handed. Have a look at this example which illustrates the same point. All tigers are mammals and all mammals are carnivores. Therefore, all tigers are carnivores. Now, in that example, again, the premises do support the conclusion. Because if they were true, the conclusion would be if all tigers are mammals and every mammal is a carnivore, then tigers would also be carnivores. But, of course, this is not a cogent argument because not all the premises are true. In particular, this second premise isn't true. Not all mammals are carnivores. Some mammals are carnivores, but some aren't. Sheep are mammals, but they're not carnivores. So this is not a cogent argument, although the premises do support the conclusion, because if the premises were true, if it really was true that all mammals were carnivores, then the conclusion would follow. But it's not a cogent or sound argument because that second premise is false. One more point to notice about this is that, of course, the conclusion is true. Tigers really are carnivores. And this illustrates a very important point. You can have a bad argument for a true conclusion. This is not a good argument, not a successful argument. But it would be a mistake to infer from that that the conclusion was false, because the conclusion is true. So an argument can fail to be sound or cogent even when it has a true conclusion. So just because you've got a bad argument, you shouldn't make the inference from that therefore the conclusion is wrong. It's just that the argument doesn't prove the conclusion. In the two arguments we've just looked at, the premises did support the conclusion. Here's an example where the premises do not support the conclusion. It starts off in the same way as the first example. Whoever the murderer is, they must be left-handed. But this time, the second premise says, Miss Green is left-handed. Aha, so she must be the murderer. But now, even if the premises were true, they would not be sufficient to establish this conclusion, that she's the murderer. The conclusion definitely does not follow in this case and wouldn't be sufficient. Here's another diagram to illustrate that. Again, here are all the left-handed people. And again, we know that the murderer is one of them, one of the left-handed people. And the second premise now tells us not that Green is outside here, but that she's one of the left-handed people. But she might be one of the many, 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 many left-handed people who are innocent, who didn't commit this murder. So the conclusion here doesn't follow. Would not be sufficient to establish that Green was guilty. Just continuing with this example for a moment, you could certainly say that, look, given that the murderer must be left-handed, then this fact about Miss Green, that she's left-handed, is relevant evidence. It's consistent, at least, with her being the murderer. It's sort of relevant, but it is not by itself sufficient to establish the conclusion, right? You'd need a lot more evidence than just that the murderer's left-handed. Oh, look, Green's left-handed. You'd also need, perhaps, a confession, motive, opportunity, witnesses. You need a lot more evidence than just that she's left-handed in order to prove that she's the murderer. So these premises do not support the conclusion, in our sense of the word support, because they're not sufficient to establish the conclusion, although they are relevant. Here's a final example where everything goes right. A simple example. All birds lay eggs, and penguins are birds, therefore penguins lay eggs. Well, in this case, the premises support the conclusion. If they were true, then the conclusion would have to be true too. If all birds lay eggs and penguins are among the birds, then penguins lay eggs. And in this case, the premises really are true. Penguins are birds, and birds really do all lay eggs. So this is a cogent or successful argument. It's an argument which succeeds in establishing its conclusion. So just to summarise, in a cogent or successful or sound argument, two things have to happen. First of all, the premises have to support the conclusion in this conditional sense. It means if the premises are all true, they'd be sufficient, give you a sufficient reason for thinking the conclusion was true. And secondly, different question, the premises have to all be true. And those are independent conditions. An argument can satisfy one, but not the other. Here's a little quiz question for you then. True or false? If all the premises in an argument are true, then they support the conclusion. Is that true or false? Hopefully you got that right. The correct answer is false. Premises in an argument could all be true, but they might fail to support the conclusion. Truth and support are independent conditions. And here's a little example to illustrate that. An argument with true premises, but where they don't support the conclusion. First premise, sheep are mammals. Well, that's true. Second premise, some mammals are carnivores. Well, that's true. Certainly some mammals are carnivores. But obviously it doesn't follow from that sheep are carnivores. So you can have an argument with true premises, but in which the premises do not support the conclusion. Here's another nice example of the fact that true premises don't necessarily mean that the conclusion is supported. When Galileo, back in the 17th century, first started looking at the stars and planets through the newly invented telescope, he could see what he thought must be moons orbiting Jupiter. He could see these little dots, bright dots next to the disk of Jupiter, which seemed to move around it from day to day and week to week. Now, that idea that there were satellites orbiting planets was inconsistent with the currently accepted and very successful astronomical theory of the day, which thought that the planets moved in concentric kind of crystalline spheres and that there were only 7 of them. So many contemporaries of Galileo thought, well, he must be wrong, right? And anyway, what is this telescope thing? It could be seeing all sorts of weird things through that don't really exist. A contemporary of Galileo's, Francesco Sisi, gave this argument for why Galileo must be wrong. He said this: there are 7 windows in the head, 7 openings in the human head, 2 nostrils, 2 ears, 2 eyes and a mouth. And from that, and many other similar phenomena, we gather that the number of planets is necessarily 7. Now, it really is true, isn't it, that there are 7 openings in the human head. There really are 2 nostrils, 2 ears, 2 eyes and a mouth. But from a modern perspective, you look at that and you think, but that has nothing to do with the number of planets. So, although the premises are true, they're completely irrelevant from a modern perspective. So they don't support the conclusion at all, even though they're true. So here's your next quiz question. True or false? If the premises in an argument are not all true, then they don't support the conclusion. True or false? And the right answer is false. We've seen examples of this already. Examples where not all the premises in an argument are true, but they do support the conclusion. Here's another example. All birds can fly. That's not true. There are some species of birds that are flightless. Emus, penguins. Second premise, eagles are birds. That's true. Conclusion, eagles can fly. Now, the premises in the argument support the conclusion because if they were both true, the conclusion would be true. So just because one or perhaps all of the premises in an argument are false, that doesn't mean they don't support the conclusion. Support is a conditional matter. If the premises were true, then the conclusion would be established. So another quick summary. In a cogent or successful or sound argument, the premises have to support the conclusion, meaning if the premises are all true, they give you a sufficient reason for accepting the conclusion, and the premises have to also be true. And those are independent conditions. An argument can satisfy one, but not the other. An argument might have true premises that don't support the conclusion, or the premises might support the conclusion, but not all be true. And finally, it's important to remember that an argument can fail to be successful even when the conclusion is true. You can have a bad argument, an unsuccessful argument, for a true conclusion. That is something people sometimes struggle with when they're evaluating arguments. What people have a tendency to do is look at the conclusion of the argument and ask whether they believe the conclusion. Is this conclusion something I agree with, something I think is true? And if the answer to that question is yes, if you do already believe the conclusion, people tend to think, oh, that must be a good argument then, must be an okay argument, after all the conclusion is fine. But that's a mistake. You can have a bad argument for a true conclusion. So you need to evaluate the argument, not just the conclusion.